and change. So simply to flag that and to also highlight that this is part and parcel of a strategy within TRS to develop a new master's programme on religion and global challenges as well. So just to give you a sort of contextualising picture of what we're up to within our subject area here. So Afira's just asked if everyone's comfortable with the fact that we're going to record the session, and clearly that will become particularly relevant when we open up the Q&A and discussions later on. Okay, I'm going to allow you to put something in the chat if you feel at all uncomfortable about that, but otherwise assume that we're all good to go and happy to have our voices and comments recorded. All right, so today we're looking at COVID-19 and how there are various social dynamics and religious responses to the pandemic, and to explore that through the good grace of our speakers. Let me tell you something about them and remind you that we're going to have Riyanti do the main session, an input of around 25 minutes, and that'll be followed by some 15-minute responses from our other speakers, from Yael and Rajan. So let me tell you first of all about Dr. Riyanti Djalante. And Riyanti's kindly provided some blurb, and I'm going to read that out to you. We can always post this around later. Riyanti is the Assistant Director for Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance at the Secretariat of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. She's a world expert on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation research and policy. She's the lead author of several IPCC, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, assessment reports of the UN Environment Programme. She's the scientific editor of the Journal of Sustainability Science and Progress in Disaster Science. And Dr. Djalante's been working closely with several UN organisations, UNDRR, UNFCCC, UNEP, UNESCO, and UNESCAP. She's a member of the Scientific Committee of the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL. I assume that's University College London, and a research fellow of the Earth System Governance Network and social science fellow of the International Council for Science. Riyanti's previously worked as a research associate at the UN University Institute of Environment and Human Security in Bonn, and as academic program officer at UN University Tokyo. She's also worked for the government in Indonesia for 10 years overall, where she's been involved in disaster management, emergency preparedness, development planning, implementations. She has consulted for internationally funded projects on issues related to governance, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation in Southeast Asia. So we are particularly delighted that Riyanti is offering her time to open out our conversation today, and we very much look forward to hearing what you've got to say, Riyanti. So we're going to hand over to her now and listen eagerly. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Afira, for inviting me for this webinar series. Thank you, Julie, for the generous introduction, and also I think Yael and Rajan Gurukkal on your time, and also I think all colleagues that are available here. Allow me, I think, to share the screen. Maybe, Afira, I think it's a better way to like do, I think, this presentation, yeah? Let me first confirm if we can see my screen now. Yes, thank you. So I will, I mean, the title of my presentation is also like what has been given by Afira. It's about COVID regional dynamics and religious response. However, I would like to also introduce some of the discussion on DRR and then how then DRR, disaster risk reduction strategies, help to then equip the governments, the society, and also some principles in DRR which help for COVID responses, particularly taking examples on some of the highly vulnerable countries to disasters, such as the Southeast Asian region. And also, I think the last part of my presentation, I will outline some of the religious, social dynamics and religious responses, in particularly taking the case study of Indonesia, the I think country with the highest population of Muslim communities in the world, 200 million live there. I think here, let me discuss on why Anthropocene and this global report have considered or have surprised. I think what's important is that COVID-19 should not be a surprise. However, things that have happened in the past, of course, lead us to then have the big impacts of COVID here. So the Anthropocene, I mean, this is the video, which the link is available. I think we can view it later. But what's important here, I think the key message is that human interference has led to like a lot of changes in the society, and human interference on the natural and societal system leads to what we have, some of the destruction on the environments that we have at the moment. I also like to use this 2021 Global Risk Outlook by the World Economic Forum. I think every year they have this Global Risk Outlook. So if we can see on the top right corner here, where some of the risks are very likely to occur, and then if it occur, then the impacts will be very high. So for example, here on climate action, biodiversity loss, environmental damage, extreme weather events. These are like the four most likely risks, and then if they occur, the impacts would even sometimes more than the impacts from weapon of mass destruction. If we see, for example, the Global Risk Report 2020, only a year before, similar patterns occur. So we have environmental risk here, which then calls for big consideration of the environment, extreme weather event, natural disasters, man-made environmental events, but none of COVID-19 was considered there. So even an agency or an institution like a World Economic Forum fail to consider the big things that is to come due to COVID here. So if we then see this global risk horizon, of course we have all been impacted by an infectious disease, but we know that this is only in short term. I think once we have the vaccine, once we strengthen public health measures and so on, we know that in the long term, natural resource crisis, biodiversity loss will bring a more even larger and stronger wave that we have here. So it's important that while we are responding to COVID in this space here, we know that we need to all this COVID recovery needs to lead to the path that is green resilience, but also inclusive and recovery. I would like to also point out, for example, only recently, 2 weeks ago, it was a UNEP report published that biodiversity loss is one of the causes which leads to uncontrolled spread of infectious disease due to biodiversity loss, particularly habitat loss from the animals carrying this viruses and bacteria. Also, I think from this report, we see that once this occur, failure for climate change adaptation, mitigation, biodiversity loss, and disasters, large-scale involuntary migration, and institutional social instability will occur in the future. So I think a great understanding on the interlinkages of how COVID and on top of other risks, other global risks is important in the future. Again, I think I'll skip these two maps here, which also show that disaster risk is global. Impacts are of course different, but we are all in this together. Like while we are responding to COVID, disasters still occur and will continue to occur. Then let me outline some of the global impacts of disasters itself. Numbers of disasters continue to increase with increasing development, increasing urbanization, increases population. The risk also increases. However, we know that global effort for disaster risk reduction is able to help reducing the number of risks. Flood is the disasters, the most frequent disasters that we know, and flood is a climatic disaster. So we know that the frequency and intensity of flood in the future, and this complicate things. For example, what we know in this period 2020 2021 is El Nino period in the southern hemisphere. What has occurred only last year, also this year, when big storms occur, government face it very difficult to respond to evacuate people while also keeping COVID-19 protocols in place in the evacuation area. So this is also why consideration of COVID, but also emerging environmental impacts will be important in the future. In terms of total death, we have been able globally to reduce greatly in terms of the number of people died from disasters. What's important, which I would like to outline here, so epidemics has been one of also a source of data that have been collected. While and we know that epidemics have caused a great deal of death in the past, and this is not a surprise, and this is also something that the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction is picking up. On top of consideration of natural hazard from floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, and so on, the interlinkages with epidemics is also important, as we have seen now with COVID-19. However, we know from disaster studies, earthquake kills people the most. And this is also important. One case study that an earthquake that recently occurred in Indonesia, it kills the most people, and also like a major infrastructure of hospitals and schools collapse the most. And when hospital collapses, then the responses to COVID that we have to do now also collapses. And that's also another interlinkages between disaster response and COVID responses. Finally, the third way we measure the impacts of disasters is on total affected person. So if we see here, total affected person is expected to increase in the future, and the region of Asia suffers the most, house the most affected people in the world. And I think in terms of its relationship to COVID, now is still unclear. However, I think one measure that we see here in terms of number of people displaced is on or number of people affected is through measuring displacement due to disasters. And this is where also a very dire story occurs. People on the move, so those in Africa and Asia, either due to conflicts such as like this orange here, or due to natural disasters, those in blue here, also suffers the most. Are the most vulnerable. They are already very vulnerable, and because they are on the move, their risk to COVID infection is also very high. And sometimes when they are on the move, they are invincible. Like no government has any record, either the sending government, the receiving government. So, and then we know with, for example, with COVID responses now that it needs to be available since COVID vaccines are very rare. Then they rely on data, and these people are sometimes not part of available data. Hence, they're missing out in the COVID responses. And finally, on total economic damage, we know that the damage also increased, and with COVID responses now, a lot of money are being redirected for COVID recovery. And I think the argument that the RR community are calling now is that this COVID-19 response should not place us in the same vulnerable path as before. We need to focus on those who are displaced by disasters, who are missing from data, focusing on the most vulnerables, and so on. Then, like here, I think I'll go briefly here on the international processes for responding to disasters, and to what extent these international processes have been also adjusting the responses in respect to COVID. I think here an integrated disaster risk reduction and management framework is something that have been called for within the DRR community. And this, we would argue, DRR community argue that some of these important terms, such as this cycle, maybe here, an integrated response, and also this cycle here. So cycle before things, during emergency and then recovery is very relevant to COVID now. And all preparation that we have, early warning system is something that is quite known in our community. Health early warning is also important. Those who are prepared, some studies shows those who are prepared through better community engagement, better disaster preparedness. They also, for example, can utilize these networks for then COVID recovery information. What we see, for example, within the ASEAN region, Vietnam, they, due to their socio-political, economic situation, it's a communist country where surveillance has been, very strong. But then it equipped them. They have the least number of infection, and also only, I think, less than 10 people died from COVID infection. And I think this is due to this early warning system, surveillance system that they have had in place before. Finally, here on Sendai frameworks, there are 7 targets which they want to reduce these 4 elements, and they want to increase these 3 elements. I think the way to link this with COVID, for example, on mortality here, we know that in the disaster database, death from biological hazard has been calculated. I think this is very important in terms of data provision, something that may have been missed within the health community. On the affected people, as we know that affected people will, by disasters, will increase in the future. Should urgent epidemics, pandemics occur, such as now, then they will be affected more. Lastly, here on critical infrastructure, we know we have program, or DRR program, of safe hospital and safe school, and this is also very relevant for COVID responses. On these DRR strategies, local disaster risk reduction strategies will not only focus on natural hazards, but also preparedness to pandemics. So being prepared to disasters will also prepare, especially community, to then other shocks such as those coming from COVID or other pandemics. Then I think the last 2 parts will focus on how this is relevant to COVID-19 responses. I think here we know within DRR, we have been calling for multi-sectors, multi-hazards, preventive and anticipatory approaches. This is also very important on the way for COVID recovery. We call for resilient COVID recovery, and resilience is a concept that have been known within DRR community. Also within DRR, we know that disaster risk is a function of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. While hazard can be static, exposure can be static. It's the societal condition that will change how hazard will become either small disasters or large-scale disasters. And strengthening resilience and reducing vulnerability is the key, which is also relevant for COVID responses here. I think the keywords that we have now, it's about resilience. Disaster resilience has been now, health system resilience has been called for. Resilience is about, being prepared for shocks, ensuring that we have enough buffer capacity, preparing preparing community, focusing on the most vulnerable, and also start thinking on rebounding and recovery better, which is also something that we are already thinking within our COVID-19 responses now. Also, we know that within disaster study, we have been calling for cross-sector transboundary approach. And also with the COVID-19, this is very relevant. Cross-sectors, transboundary, we are as strong as our weakest link. And that's what we know from the health slogan. And this is something that have been also known from DRR. Finally, I would, this is some of the examples. So what are some of the changes? Japan, several countries in Indonesia have been experiencing, even during COVID-19, have been experiencing earthquake, tsunami, floods, and so on. These are some of the pictures of how changes have been made. For example, in Japan, this is a usual one here, where, in a big hall, safe, big school hall, people are evacuated here. Social distancing was not there before, but now, with some adjustment, the social distancing, at least some measure to isolate people and families have been done. Also, earthquake and tsunami still occurred in 2021. So tsunami evacuation during COVID-19 have been issued everywhere, especially for schools and hospitals, thanks to the existing program that we have on Safe School and Safe Hospital initiative. Also, since we have been measured, there are communities have measured people affected. So COVID-19 pandemic impacts on internally displaced people have been also, been studied a lot. So focusing on leaving no one behind, I think it's very important. Then finally, last part here, religious responses, taking some examples from Indonesia. This is Makkah, the center of worship before and after COVID. We never thought, as a Muslim, I would never thought that Makkah would be empty, but then we know that it has been empty for some times, and there is already some measures to ensure that COVID-19 procedures is met. In Indonesia, like this message of stay healthy and stay hopeful have been introduced. Multi-faith pray, by which 6 different religion organizations head chief are being called by the government every day to have a pray for the nation. Vaccination of head of religious organizations, they have been one of the most targeted people in the country, so that to ensure that so to ensure acceptance by all religions. This is I put here imun and iman. So imun is the word Indonesian for immunity. So the flip side is iman, which is the translation of faith. So this term imun and iman have been introduced a lot in the country. So when making yourself immune or stronger to the infection is one of your act of faith, something like that. Yeah. which then if you see the panelists here represent also a different religious organization. Another way, another dynamism, religious dynamism, I think here on this slogan that the vaccine is safe and halal. So this is very important. We see that these different logos of different organizations saying that this is halal, this is safe, and also the president, when he was first vaccinated, that's the background at the back. It's safe and it's halal. So this is the two keywords to ensure that public acceptance for the vaccine. Again, yeah, webinar by various religious organizations. Also, here, Ministry of Religion is COVID-19 positive. So also another message to ensure that it doesn't matter which religion you are from, you can be the head or the minister, but the COVID can affect everyone. Then of course, you know, adherence to burial has been followed. However, I think this is only a very recent development that only occurred this week. Yeah, families, because of the law, so family then follows their, you know, the victims are buried into separate place. But then what happens after sometimes family came back to this burial place and stole the bodies of their families. So this is something that is very new, also only observed this week. And if you see the police line here, because then they said, you know, if you stole these bodies, affected bodies, then it will be against the law. I think this is the end of my presentation. I would say that I think a lot of things that can be learned and can be passed by the way disaster risk reduction community then has been helpful for to help COVID-19 recovery. We also adjustment are made, but of course religious response is something that is very important and very crucial, especially in this messaging to ensure that the practice is used, and also now when we are entering this vaccination stage. So I think that's the end of my presentation. I will return it to Julie or Ophira. Thank you very much.
Well, Riyanti, thank you for that excellent and whistle-stop but thorough tour of the relevant issues. I'm not going to open it up for conversation just yet because I want our respondents to first do their slots. So I'm going to hand over straight away, if I may, to Professor Rajan Gurukkal. And welcome, Professor Gurukkal. Allow me now to just give you some outline of his background prior to his session with us. Professor Gurukkal is Vice Chairman of the Kerala State Council of Higher Education. He's a historian and social scientist. He's published very widely in both English and Malayalam. His most prominent works are his book, Social Formations in Early South India. That's with OUP in 2009. Rethinking Classical Indo-Roman Trade, Political Economy in the Eastern Mediterranean Exchange Relations, and History and Theory of Knowledge Production, which was an OUP book in 2018. He's a well-known advocate of social and gender equality and environmental justice in India and in Kerala. He utilizes his expansive knowledge of history and society in disseminating knowledge in the mass media. So Professor Rajan is an activist, you might say, alongside his academic role. Professor Gurukkal has held several positions in different Indian higher education institutes, such as Dean of the Faculty, Member of Academic Councils, Senates, syndicates of a few universities and social science research. He's also the former Chancellor, Vice Chancellor of Mahatma Gandhi University in Kottayam, India, and currently a visiting professor at the Centre of Contemporary Studies, Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. Professor Gurukkal, you are very, very welcome, and we thank you sincerely for joining us today.
I hope I am audible as well as visible. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, Dr. Julie, Dr. Ofira, fellow speakers, everybody. Thank you, Riyanti, and your scholarly presentation is really inspiring. But I was given another paper, a joint paper by yourself and co-authors. Uh, Anyway, both the uh, presentations I combine and then make some very general comments. Uh, Analyzing the response experience, key health related strategies and roles of different agencies in the responses, and the gaps and limitations in the current strategies. Your joint article puts forward recommendations for more systematic approaches to improve the efficacy of future responses. Your response, your recommendations are insightful and educative for the stakeholders to improve the existing national policy options. As a rapid appraisal and a down to earth pragmatic document, your joint work is excellent. So, congratulations. Now, what you presented here with focus on religion and society, that is really a very comprehensive kind and an overall, uh, um, uh, at the same time, grounded approach to macro reality. I enjoyed that too. Let me confine my remarks to two aspects of the article sent to me. First is the initiative aspect, and the other is the enunciative aspect. Regarding the initiative aspect, I'm thinking about the ways and means of changing the article uh, as a much more rigorous academic piece. Now, the article serves a very important recommendatory role, advisory support to the government. But as academics, we look forward to uh, a research kind of study coming out of it. So, how to enhance the present article's heuristic strength as an empirical appraisal? um, I mean, how to make it stronger as a pragmatic document. So initially, it is meant to do that, but as a very rapid appraisal kind, it requires some more deeper probing, even to make it a very strong pragmatic document. In other words, here my concern is how to help strengthen the recommendations. Even if it is an advisory document, then we can strengthen it further. I think a comparative understanding of cross-cultural experiences and success models will provide fresh insights to modify and enrich your recommendations. Now, you have now presented a very brilliant overview of the global situation and also the Anthropocene background and all sorts of things. But in the article sent to me, it was altogether different. So various things I point out may look irrelevant because of what you have presented at the moment. For example, the cross-cultural experience issue regarding the first document, I think uh, cross-cultural learning experience regarding COVID-19 responses would be uh, helpful for strengthening some of the uh, some of the recommendations. Now, for example, one area which I know better is my own state. So learning experience of Kerala model COVID response, I think will be useful. For example, see, as you know, Kerala's COVID-19 crisis management has drawn global attention for a variety of reasons. You can examine what the developed world found amazing about Kerala's responses to the pandemic as an object to be analyzed further. There is some comparability in the various responses of Indonesia and Kerala. But one thing that is exceptional about Kerala is risk communication and community engagement. Empowered women uh, from a society of high literacy forming self-help groups, Kudumbashree, helped the cause in a big way, forming close to 2 lakh WhatsApp groups with the 22 lakh neighborhood groups to educate on key safety measures and advocated by the government during the lockdown period. Uh, then a community kitchen initiative through the local self-governing departments with the support of Kudumbashree again has provided more than uh, uh, 86 lakhs meals to the laborers who used to depend on daily wage, but during the lockdown period having no income, these people were offered food in common community kitchens. uh, those who were in quarantine, in isolation, and then destitutes and other needy persons were all fed. And the chief minister said that nobody in Kerala should be starving because of COVID-19 and lockdown. Distribution of millions of cooked meals and provision of free ration under the public distribution scheme to those in need is reflective of a well thought out and a caring response and a relief strategy. And when you think in terms of making an appraisal of uh, cross cultural experiences, if Kerala is becoming educative and is helpful for strengthening your recommendations, I think my recommendation here is is able to make sense. Kerala's model of controlling epidemic, it owes to the extensive network of quality healthcare system built up over the years. WHO has been a long-standing partner in the field of public health development at the village panchayat, block panchayat, and district levels. Ms. Payden, acting WHO representative to India, attributes Kerala's success in effectively responding to the COVID-19 to its experience and systemic investment in healthcare systems, strengthening along with the measures such as surveillance, risk communication and community engagement, early detection, and broad social support, and so on. Now, she said that Kerala model could serve as a great example for others to emulate. It's in this context I recommend cross-comparative, cross-cultural comparison in general and an intense study of the Kerala experience, perhaps useful for EU people to strengthen the recommendation side. Now, again, on a deeper analysis, you notice what is the running thread of political control across the widespread public healthcare institutions, local bodies of self-governance, multiple cooperatives, distributive channels, charitable societies, community service organizations, and other agencies guaranteeing compassionate action on war footing. Uh, it coalesces different agencies of conflicting interests into a single team with common goal, having absolute precedence of human values over economic gains. This distinct setup enables the state to effectively encounter the pandemic lockdown and its social consequences like livelihood loss, workers without income, farmers with unsold products, unemployment, abject poverty, starvation, etc. It helps the state facilitate voluntary redistribution of wealth and circulation of essential goods without profit motives, ensuring social security. This is governmental restructuring of the economy into a resilient and equitable alternative extending goods, services, and credit for people. It is at once the redesigning of a new pattern of social existence of high adaptability to stagnation as a new normal. So, now drawing insights from the Kerala experience, I think you can advise how the government should evolve policies of social care nets, strengthen public health, provide economic stimulus to local enterprises, and combine growth with equity. Kerala's case of governmental priority to people's livelihood security, uh, and then uh, the work sharing, food security measures, basic income scheme, etc., uh, did reverse the capitalist redistributive functions. That's all about the initiative side, and then your study as a thorough empirical uh, assessment and pragmatic advisory document. Now, let me now come to the enunciative aspect of it. I find the enunciative aspect not quite articulate, although it is very much there in the presentation you made now, but in the other document, I could not see this very much. It is therefore necessary to think about the ways and means of making the initiative enunciative, transforming the empirical appraisal into an intellectual assessment. I mean, developing the heuristic into hermeneutic in order to strengthen the article with interpretations and explanations, which you are doing abundantly, I mean, profusely in the presentation. But the document, I was not satisfied with this aspect. It is graduating the pragmatic into theoretical through a more rigorous methodological preoccupation. I am satisfied by the method of empirical data capture followed in the study. It has successfully grasped the externality that provides the study, its a priori or analytical ontology, answering what it means. A study made by a team of different disciplines, its ontology is multidisciplinary. But there is a layer of meanings and ideas hidden below the externality, which is accessible through methodology as the science of method. So when I talk about methodology, I differentiate method from methodology. Method is the way of doing, but methodology is the science of ways of doing. Methodological accession of this regime I am talking about, the unseen regime or the regime hidden below the surface, or the regime that is not present in the externality. For accessing that, we need methodological strategies. It alone can answer how and why it works. If externality will help us answer what it means, methodological preoccupation, and then uh, the analysis of hidden meanings and ideas below the externality uh, alone will help us answer or explain how and why. How and why answers constitute explanatory knowledge, hermeneutic, that is enunciative and theoretical. It is this category of knowledge belonging to none of the established disciplines which deserves to be called interdisciplinary. Now, sometimes even academics make a confusion between interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, and often the terms are interchangeably used. Actually, interdisciplinary knowledge is the knowledge that does not belong to any of the established disciplines. It is not contesting with the disciplines, but at the same time, it's generating knowledge by identifying an object of knowledge that transcends constituted disciplines. So, this knowledge is a posteriori or synthesized ontology amenable to epistemological validation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gurukkal, for that extremely lucid account there. And I'm now going to, without any further delay, hand over to our next speaker. And I'd like to just say a little bit more about Dr. Yael Artzy-Randrup. Yael is Assistant Professor in Theoretical Ecology at the Department of Theoretical and Computational Ecology at the Institute for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Dynamics. And she's a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Amsterdam. Yael's an expert in complex systems in the area of theoretical ecology and evolution. She studies multi-scale dynamical systems integrating bottom-up and top-down approaches with computational and mathematical models, including complex networks and agent-based models. One of Yael's main research focuses has been in the area of epidemiology, where she studies the ecology and evolution of infectious diseases and dynamics of disease spread over space and time. Yael has spent many years working on diseases like malaria and other multi-strain pathogens, as well as West Nile virus and other zoonotic diseases, including COVID-19. While she's very much a theoretician, her work is closely tied with real-world applications and with strong social relevance. For example, in recent years, Yael's been developing a novel approach for metastatic cancer eradication based on an eco-evolutionary framework, but she's also been working in the area of energy transition, governance of green water, and the interaction between social and environmental dynamics, and identifying hotspots of potential spillover. So we're very thrilled that Yael's agreed to take part in the roundtable. And without further ado, let me hand over to her. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to participate in the special panel. I'm from the sciences, but I love having opportunities to speak from people from humanities and from the social systems. It usually provides new areas and angles of seeing the world around us that I really don't have an opportunity to meet in my environment. So it's a very, these opportunities are really priceless for me. So I wasn't completely sure what to prepare for today. I wasn't completely sure what I was going to be hearing. And I think also one of the reasons that Fira put me last. So I would like to make some comments on the two excellent presentations we just saw. Thank you for those to both speakers. And then I was hoping that maybe we could open a discussion. So maybe I'd ask some questions and hear responses, because one of the things I've noticed also with discussions that I've had with Ophira is that we use similar words, but we don't always necessarily mean the same things. This, of course, can happen within the humanities, but it can also, it happens when you try to cross over different paradigms, different areas of research. One such term is the term resilience. Resilience is a word or definition that's been argued about in the area of ecology since the late 70s. It's still being discussed. And I think one of the interesting things as a theoretical ecologist is that we many times notice that just having these arguments leads to new observations. So once there was recognition that not all natural systems are necessarily stable by nature, or this question of what stability means in the late 70s started to arise, and really within a year or two, there'd been a long list of terms that are relating to stability. Stability, resilience, robustness, and so on and so forth. Getting into the, why am I raising this? I'll get into a practical matter. So Professor Rajan Gurukkal asked, how could we, well, he used slightly different words, so I'm sorry, I'm changing the question slightly, but, and please correct me if I'm wrong. How could we strengthen the pragmatism and applicability of the recommendations or of the approaches to a disaster risk reduction that had been raised in the very good presentation originally by Riyanti. And so I think one important answer is in the definition itself of the word resilience. So from the area I come from, we can speak about resilience as being something, a system where it's perturbed would be able to shift itself back to a functionally similar situation from before the perturbation. So this is a little bit different from the way I think Ophira was defining the term resilience, but because it does allow moving away from the original state to a different state. So it does allow some form of evolution, but functionally in terms of what we define as functionally important, the system still remains intact. So it finds new ways. And I'm sorry, I'm sort of putting these words as finds, or because of course a system doesn't have its own goals or aims, but the system sort of transitions to a place that's functionally similar. But below, underneath this description, this definition, what's really important is that resilience is actually represents a tension between two families of feedbacks, positive feedbacks and negative feedbacks. So negative feedbacks are any types of responses that suppress some sort of disturbance or some sort of shift. So if we think, for example, of a population that has a certain amount of food, and we think that the population may have grown a little bit too big, then they deplete the amount of resources they have, and they can't have their fertility goes down, and then the population decreases. And if it's below a certain sort of carrying capacity, it can increase because it has more resources. So this is a type of self-regulation in the system, and it has this negative feedback effect because any transition away from that carrying capacity, how much food is available in the system. So I'm sorry, I'm taking an example from ecology. But any transition away from that expected equilibrium, that expected carrying capacity, essentially drives the system back to where it's supposed to be. So this is a negative feedback. Negative feedbacks many times are considered, they sound to us like something bad, but they're actually the ones that we're hoping to achieve. They're our goal. The positive feedbacks are many times the ones we need to be careful of. Positive feedbacks are those type where they start to self-amplify. So if we're thinking, for example, of processes of extinction, we're thinking, for example, of a species whose territory has been disturbed, maybe it's been fragmented, it becomes partitioned into smaller subpopulations. These subpopulations may not be functioning as well, so they may also be, the individuals inside may also be more sensitive to predation or to invasion of pathogens. Then those subpopulations may become even smaller. Anyhow, the idea is that positive feedbacks will usually lead a disturbance to become bigger and bigger. So if we're thinking about what we actually need to reduce the effects of disasters, remember, second, I just made a few notes here that I wanted to read out. Riyanti had mentioned early warning, preparedness, surveillance. These are all super important, but we have to understand what their context is. We have to understand how they play into a negative feedback cycle. Because if they can't actually generate a negative feedback to how some sort of disaster occurs, then it really doesn't matter which types of measures we take. We could be in a very bad situation. So I think my first comment was to say that I think one key point is to start studying where the positive and where the negative potential feedbacks are. And those would be the key to understanding where we should be, where people should be investing their attention. And this would also help create higher resilience and applicability of different control measures. So this brought me to a second comment I wanted to make. So for one, we want to know about these feedbacks, these chains of responses. Secondly, it's extremely important to know about circumstances. One of the most interesting things that we're learning now from the mass extinction events is that they're very much fed by multiple disturbances. So there may be one major disaster happening, but depending on the circumstances, these many times when you have overlap of different circumstances, these would actually be, or negative circumstances, these would be actually the components of generating these synergistic processes of decline. And we see it all the time with extinctions. We see that a lot of money may be spent, a lot of effort to save natural populations, and it seems to be impossible because either they're targeting only one disturbance without recognizing the fact that there is this internal, intrinsic feedback going on, or because there are these multiple intrinsic interactions that are essentially making it impossible to save many of these declining populations. Another aspect that has to do with circumstances also has to do with timing. And this is something I think we saw very much of in COVID. Areas, or I see it now in some of the data I'm looking at in Brazil, countries and areas that already had information about how the dynamics are taking place in other places, very much helped them to escape the very negative impacts of the epidemic. And this is important to take into account for a minute, because it seems maybe trivial, but obviously when you have a little more information, you can be more prepared. But there's more to this. We need to recognize that many times disastrous effects have this property of critical transitions, and they're very much sensitive to the initial conditions. So even if a city would have been attacked by, had COVID immigrate just a week later, small shifts in the way, in the preparedness really had a very big impact on the result and how big the epidemic actually ended up being. And it's a much bigger shift than our intuition, because we don't usually live in critical times. We're used to living in times where small shifts lead to small results. But in critical times, in times of criticality, for example, with COVID, where you're actually transitioning from very low-key spread to a massive epidemic that's completely out of control, the dynamics have completely different rules. Rules that are power law, where the initial conditions really do make a big, really do have a big impact. And I wanted to take that to where people play into this. So how people actually perceive their role in times of criticality, and maybe where religion takes a role in this. So one of the things I find most interesting when I am speaking with people, so I spent quite a bit of time this past year trying to explain and tell and answer questions, and many people write me personally and have many different questions about what's dangerous, what's not, and so on, is that it seems that there's this sort of general trend where people think, well, I went outside and I walked around and I met people and nothing happened to me. So I don't really think there's something extremely dangerous out here. And I think it's extremely interesting that people don't recognize their role in the system as a whole. Now, it's true that in our very, very large world, in our very dense world, one person is nothing relative to the whole. And it's true that maybe in regular circumstances, a person has relatively little effect. But in times of criticality, people have a very big effect on the produced outcomes, but they don't recognize this because this isn't the way they usually see themselves. And it's interesting also that they don't recognize that societies and patterns and processes are a result not of the group of individuals that make these societies, but rather of their interactions between these people. It's about the interactions and it's about the feedbacks. This is what causes things to spread. This is what causes either something to grow or to decline. If something's declining, it's because negative feedbacks are suppressing, or if something grows, it's because positive feedbacks are making something grow. So if we're thinking, for example, of how religion may influence, or how these public messages that were created for people, it's not so much necessarily the message itself that was the power, it was rather whether it has a secondary effect, whether it actually generates a chain effect. So if a person sees one of these messages, if it actually leads this person to tell someone else or to comment to someone else, then this has the potential to grow, to spread, just like an epidemic, because spreading of ideas and spreading of information is exactly like the spread of a pathogen. It's spreading across a network. And the question is, if the network stays extremely localized, and then it's only a very small component, or if it crosses this, this critical transition of really generating throughout. And it's this transition between local spread and spreading throughout a network is a critical transition. It's not something that's linear. It's also not something that's exponential. It really is a very critical shift between small to all. So anyhow, I just wanted to bring in a few of these principles from complex systems because I feel they're relevant to these discussions here, and they're relevant for multiple sort of directions. Okay, so if you have questions, or maybe we could discuss a bit, I'd be happy to do that now.
Thank you so much. So we've got some amazingly interesting angles in order to approach these questions. And I open up the conversation. There may be questions you want to put to one of the speakers, or it could be that you've got comments or overall remarks, or perhaps from your own perspective, there are issues arising that you want to kind of put on the table, our communal table, and see how people respond to that. So would anyone like to weigh on in there? And I'll be watching your hands, and I'll also be watching the chat for things that you might want to put in there too. You might have noticed that Psycho's put something in there about her experience in Japan. I'm going to come to that later, but let's get some energy going in terms of our conversation right here and now.
I'm really sorry. There is somebody working with the machine, so it might be noisy. Thank you very much, the three of you, for your presentations, and thank you for the audience. I hope that the few who gathered today in the Zoom might have some questions or comments. Just to bring back the whole issue to religion and why religious response I felt was something important to deal with. And also, this is something, I'm really sorry for the noise. It's also something that came up in conversations between me and Yael. It's the issue of ideology. And ideology drives people to action, whether I'm not sure how to, it's very new to me, this whole idea of negative and positive, but there is something within the minds of individuals that connects them outwardly, but it's also there inwardly. And that's where religion comes in. Religion is a type of organization and a type of ideology. And what we see happening around us with the COVID, I mean, and I think there are lots of interesting differences to discuss maybe some other time on how people react in Indonesia and India and Asia and Africa maybe, and how people react in the Western world, because whether misinformation, for example, and Riyanti writes about it in her article, that misinformation started spreading via religious institutions to encourage people to use herbal medicines. It happened also in India, I think, right? But misinformation looks completely different in the Western world. And it is driven by different types of ideologies. And it feels like, you know, in the Western world, we don't have this kind of traditional religion. We have maybe, but there is not much big difference in the way people react and organize and mobilize each other, basically to, I'm not sure whether it's positive or negative, Yael, but to push away the social distancing or the scientific or even non-pharmaceutical interventions that are offered to the public in order to avoid the spread of the infection. So that was my, you know, just 2 words. I don't want to take too much time, and maybe Riyanti and Rajan would like to also to react to what Yael was saying and maybe also develop a little bit more. Rajan touched it a little bit in relation to, also Riyanti, in relation to Vietnam and in relation to Kerala. There is a certain social and political culture and certain ways of organization that help facilitate a good response, right, to the COVID, and to avoid further disasters occurring. Anyways, I'll stop now and maybe I'll...
So I was, so I think one area that's sort of interesting to check into is to what extent a person sees themselves as part of the whole. To what extent do they find their being, their existence, or their behavior actually influential in a group? I can think of smaller societies where there is a disaster time, there's time of risk where people actually reach out to help others, more sort of, it's more sort of embedded in the culture. And I think in Western society, we see that people somehow feel more isolated, maybe more disconnected from the whole. And in many ways, maybe this, you know, fake news, fake ideas is something that touches people in a way where they think they can make a difference, at least, you know, on their friends. But when we're speaking about regulations of COVID, maybe they think they have very little impact on others. So to what extent are they actually part of a process taking place? And like I said, it's extremely important in these moments of transition for people to recognize how important their roles are. But maybe religion exactly taps into that. So I just wanted to sort of frame it in this way and wonder if it's relevant.
Yeah, I think it is relevant. And you know, it's like we should be careful to make a too rigid distinction between West and the rest.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's the West is not homogeneous, and what is East really in this context. But it looks like, I mean, I think you touched on some kind of a scale of individuality and collectivity, that there is a range of different communities and societies of different approaches. And I think that this kind of isolation that we experience in the on one end of, you know, a privatization and individualization of the spectrum, I think that is partly the reason. But still, even in this feeling of isolation and more individualistic societies, still you do have those kind of waves that carry with them people. They share a certain ideology.
But maybe it is very much about of movement that brings people more into a center where they are, you know, communicating with their local environments. If we were in a world where we were very much organized into very local communities, you know, the situation may look completely different. I put this background on purpose behind me because it represents what's known as a network, where we see the nodes. So the nodes would be, for example, people. And we see connections between the nodes, which would be some sort of interaction. Or these, of course, could represent different types of interactions. But what's extremely important to recognize here, and it's difficult, a bit difficult to show, but if we would consider this type of just, you know, these individuals without those connections, without those links between them, this would be a completely disconnected node network. And when you start throwing in connections, interactions, even randomly, between every two agents here, every two people, you start getting subcomponents, but they're still relatively small. And interestingly enough, there's a very sharp transition where you're just adding one or two more links and suddenly the entire thing, the entire network is connected. So that's really important to know that these localized interactions between these different nodes, between these different people, can really have an enormous effect on how information spreads, on how fake news spreads, on how willingness to participate spreads, on how disease spreads. This is one of the reasons we need to keep social distancing, because this type of link really represents the distance we stand from other people. If we're standing just a little bit closer, the epidemic can just brush through. But if we stand a little farther from each other, it would die out. It's not going to spread. So these types of networks are extremely powerful to try to describe how you actually can communicate with a society. But the individuals in the society, to what extent they feel part of the whole, to what extent they are actually part of the process taking place, maybe that's something that's it's important to think or consider.
Thank you. And just linked to that, perhaps, can I draw your attention to Edo's comment in the chat there, because he's picking up on what Yael was talking about in relation to exponential change. And I think he's referring to the sort of self-amplifying element of the sort of positive feedback loop that you can get from these changes. But I mean, Edo might want to come in and say for himself the precise nature of his question, but in any case, yeah, if you can perhaps expand on how the exponential element is relevant to right here and now.
So I'm saying, it can be a very small difference. Well, I'll say it a little bit differently, maybe, because I'd already mentioned it in one way, but there's always several ways to describe a phenomena. We're used to thinking in our daily life that if we do something just slightly different from average, the outcome may be just slightly different from average. We're used to thinking in normal distributions. For example, heights in a population are distributed normally. Some people are slightly higher and some people are slightly shorter. we're used to thinking of, you know, we may be slightly early for a meeting or we may be slightly late, but there's this sort of average. And there is a standard deviation that we intuitively pick up on. We know what being very late means versus slightly late. So we know what the standard deviation of our behavior means. And we pick up on these signals. This is part of our nature to identify what the mean behavior is, for example, and how much we can deviate from that. We look for these patterns. In moments of these critical transitions, the cause and effect starts behaving very differently. You can move just slightly in your response, and it could have a very major effect on the outcome. It means that if people continue sort of averaging in those circumstances, the effect may be much more extreme than we would expect. Particularly when we're considering that people may be slightly social distancing more or slightly social distancing less. The more they're social distancing less, the closer they are to that critical transition where the epidemic can take off. And it could actually vary, it wouldn't balance out with the people just slightly social distancing less, I mean more. So we don't have that symmetry anymore. One of the features of the way things are distributed in those times of criticality is that there is no standard deviation. It's infinite. There is a mean behavior, but it doesn't have a standard deviation. So we can't really expect what a little is and what a lot is. And in that sense, this brings me back to the initial conditions, where we start from. So I noted very briefly earlier that I've been looking into the patterns of Manaus in Brazil that have been struck very badly from COVID twice already. And it's interesting to see how states around Amazonia reacted quite quickly to what they started seeing happen in the second wave of Manaus. Their social distancing essentially took place a few days earlier than Manaus would have if we're making the analog, which led them not to have epidemics of those scales, led their hospitals not to collapse. So if in Manaus, they would have started practicing the social distancing just a few days before Christmas, rather than waiting for the cases to start rising a bit too much, by the end of February, they wouldn't have had potentially, it's likely that by the end of December, they would have been in a much better state than they actually were. So these few days difference, what I call initial conditions, can really be very influential in these times of criticality. Does that help answer the question?
Ido?
Let's assume that it does, and Eda can say something or put something in the chat. Yeah, that sounds good. So I just want to pick up on what Professor Gurukkal was talking about in terms of the good practice in Kerala. That was extraordinary to hear about the community kitchen initiatives, for example, and making sure that people whose livelihoods had been destroyed by the lockdown were still able to eat and so on, and the WhatsApp messaging, other kinds of practices. These good practices we need to be collecting, identifying, learning from, and translating to different contexts. And I know that there are a number of initiatives underway attempting to do that. I'll just give an advertisement for one of the initiatives that I'm involved in tangentially through an initiative called the Joint Learning Initiative. I'll put a link to that in the chat, but through especially the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University in America, they've been gathering a lot of the amazing religious good practices in relation to COVID-19. So I'm really just wanting to advertise, if you're interested, the excellent website, webinars, and other initiatives that you can see if you visit Georgetown University's Berkeley Center to learn about how they're trying to gather some of the good practices that are happening in relation to religious groups. So I'll put something in the chat about that. But also another thing I picked up, and I'm just going to fire this out to the generality in case you have any views on this. From some of the development actors I've been involved with, there seems to be some fatigue around the use of the term resilience. And I don't know if you guys are picking that up or not in your own situations, you know, a sense that perhaps this term isn't quite so robust and useful, and maybe we should be moving away from it. And I haven't got a view on that, but I wonder whether some of you guys might have. Or if not, please just you know, raise another question or bring a new point to the table.
Could it be a problem, or maybe a problem of definition? Because I know what people would like to get out of the term resilience, what the goals are, but I'm not always completely hearing a grasp of what resilience requires.
Riyanti, maybe you would like to respond to that?
Thank you, Ophira. I think on the use of term resilience, the way I see it is resilience, of course, it's not perfect. Yeah, even now, like there is this a terminology called just resilience is introduced, because they say, you know, resilience, it's about, you know, strengthening capacity, you know, ensuring that we have this absorptive capacity, like beyond normal capacity, so that we can have a place to share these responsibilities and so on. However, I see the use as being useful, which plays greater space for discussion, multidisciplinary between communities discussion. I think practices, say like a developmental organization, governmental organization, adopting the word resilience. I mean, I think one of the first major event, I mean, the first global disaster risk reduction framework on Hyogo framework for action, building the resilience of nations and communities to disasters. It then creates space for discussion, for sharing, not only within you know, practitioner themselves, but also between, you know, researchers, science providers, and so on. And I think that's sometimes now, say, working for the UN, international organizations, there is always a way to use to use new lens to examine all problems. Then I think how it moves, you know, from, you know, vulnerability, then to resilient, now even to transformation, transition, transformation. I think it offers way for, you know, for continuous engagement with the same problem, you know, same issue, but a new way of thinking. Although people may argue that it's not new. Yeah. Thank you.
There's a comment in the chat. What I know is that the term of being resilient is like a community capacity to overcome disasters. Yeah, that's. I think that the criticism, maybe Riyanti or Rajan would like to correct me on that, but my impression is that the criticism about resilience is why should communities be resilient to disasters if we can reduce the disaster risk? So it's like kind of raising the bar that humans and communities, especially the vulnerable populations, they should be resilient because we want to continue developing and making profit and so forth and so on. So the question is whether it's fair, to expect people to be resilient towards the problems that they didn't, create. It's not because the populations grow or they are using resources, but it's because, there is this system in place that is taking advantage of that. And a similar, also the question is who is resilient, right? Who remains resilient? Who do we want to gain this robustness, right? So do we want the financial system to be resilient, or do we want, who do we want to be resilient to what? So these are, and then there are the issues of transition and transformation. That's a term that also Yael was mentioning, the way that she sees transition as from the perspective of evolution and ecology and so forth and so on, is a little bit different than what they use in social sciences about transition, right? Or transformation, that we want to transform those systems that create the vulnerabilities and exacerbate them and create the risks and so forth and so on. So again, that's a question of terminology, but I think that when you view those terms from social sciences, it's pretty different than when you view it from evolutionary biology.
I want to say not evolutionary biology as much as complex systems or dynamical systems. The terms I was considering come from these areas of dynamical / complex systems.
Oh, that's good. We have a glossary.
But I should say I'm still very much lacking the underlying mechanism. So I understand the need for resilience and I understand what the goal is, but where is the mechanism, or where is the discussion of the mechanism that provides resilience? And resilience is very much about some sort of regulating process that manages to suppress and to restructure versus losing all control, going, having a chain reaction where everything collapses. And so in our world, we call this feedbacks. And I am very much missing somehow this part of, this is a fundamental component of our view of resilience, where the feedbacks, it's almost impossible to separate the two. So I wonder in what language, or how are these types of regulating processes being raised?
One problem is, see, we are not distinguishing term from the word. Actually, term has no synonyms. Term has a specific scientific meaning, whereas word has only contextual semantics. Word can be used as lexical words or as metaphors. So you can borrow the technical meaning and then adapt that to the context and use as a word. But there should always be a clear differentiation between term and word. So, as I explained very clearly in the horizon of ecology, resilience is a term, and but we have freedom to use the term as a word by taking the whole meaning in a different context. See, for example, you talk about symbiosis, which is an ecological technical word, but in humanities and social sciences, we talk about cultural symbiosis. Actually, there isn't anything called cultural symbiosis, but with some idea about the actual biological context of symbiosis, we attribute organic attributes to the cultural context and then use the term as a word there. That is the case with the resilience as well.
I completely agree. I'm wondering again though about the if we want to apply this conceptually, because this is essentially where we're meeting, right? Where are those processes, those mechanisms that actually can promise resilience? Because resilience is not something that just can be promised by having a list of measures. It's something that can dynamically react as a function of the input that it gets. So I'm sorry, I sort of described this in a very a sort of mechanistic way, but where are those feedbacks?
Just to come in, I think that one of the very helpful features of Riyanti's talk was the way in which she showed the interconnections between these various risks that we are living with these days. The charts, for example, at the beginning, and to link up what Riyanti was saying to Yael's observations, the COVID-19 disaster has been a perturbation in what you might call was a more or less solid state system that now has been further destabilized in a very unhelpful fashion. That is to say that the aftershocks are multiple. There's economic aftershock, there's displaced people aftershocks, there's health system aftershock, educational aftershock, and these are multiple consequences that we're going to be dealing with. This is very destabilizing. You might say it's one of these positive feedback loops that just making matters worse. So it's certainly not helping dampen down the issue. So we're going to be living with this. I mean, another thought that comes to me, if I can just throw this in, is because of the pushback by religious groups and religiously inspired individuals. The slide there that Riyanti showed of the people digging up the body of their beloved relative afterwards was a very stark image for me, and to see the way in which burial practices and trying to push safe burial practices, for example, during the Ebola crisis as well, and now again with COVID, is such a very emotionally charged thing. But also, if I think of what some of the debates were in the UK, there was a huge pushback by religious communities, especially Christian religious churches, wanting to keep people coming to their services that at that time were not safe places. So, for example, people still administering bread and wine in an unsafe practice, or not socially distancing, or having signs of peace or other interactions that were not socially distanced. And religious leaderships being part of the problem rather than part of the solution, and of course taking an economic hit because of people not going to churches and giving money in the same way they might normally do. So anyway, this is only just, all of this, but I simply cite it as a reminder of the way in which there's often religious pushback in all kinds of different ways, both at an institutional level and also at the individual level.
I think it's very late in Indonesia, isn't it, Riyanti? I don't want to continue keeping you awake. Yeah, but I think that Yael's question is something to really take.
Sure.
Yeah. Rajan, you wanted to say something?
No. So I think we can say good night and
Yeah.
go to bed.
Yeah, it's very late also in India already, right? It's getting late.
It's only 7 o'clock here.
Not that late.
We have time. The only thing
Okay.
is
Yeah.
I have to go out and have a walk. That's all.
Yeah, it's late enough. But I
Are
think
there any final points that people want to make, or things to put in the chat, perhaps, just in order to begin to wind up the conversation out of respect for our colleagues joining us in very anti-social hours of the day?
yeah, well, I think that question that echoes in my mind that Yael kind of put on the table. I think that's the most important thing to think about, and I don't think we really have it. Maybe the disaster risk reduction agencies have lots of plans to deal with that, but we don't really know, I think, what is that kind of mechanism that might support the resilience in that term that will feed back the interactions between the different components of our very complex systems of society, politics, religions, beliefs, material realities that, yeah, it looks like we are actually experiencing a kind of collapse more than anything else, but
I think in the underlying, I think they definitely take this into account. There's very smart and capable people and educated people there. I think sometimes when it becomes applied more widely, some people may not know. I mean, I see this in the epidemic and the everything that had to do with COVID, that the theory and the knowledge was very deep. But when you meet a doctor or you meet someone at the hospital, just on the first line, their understanding is very different. And sometimes this gap can mean that there's a loss of being able to apply the the original meaning.
I pick up on Sunha's comment in the chat. Thank you, Sunha, for raising the issue of the supply of the food chain supply and community food resilience. That's an important point. Very grateful to you for making that point. And I also then just invite the speakers, if they have a comment that they'd like to make or to wind up, or some take home that they want to offer us before we close down the conversation. Riyanti, may I ask if there's anything you particularly want to add in at this stage?
Okay, thank you, Julie. I think maybe this conclusion here is what I see emerging now within my work in disaster risk reduction. The way, like learning from COVID, this term, a new term even gets introduced called anticipatory action. So it's about, I think, even coming to the realization that we have these early warning systems, we have, the best mind, but it seems that the world is unprepared for COVID. Even in the world risk map, very different 2020 and 2019 than coming to 2020 and 2021. So I think it goes back to this notion of leaving no one behind. The way we see that this shock responsive social protection may be the key to then at least focusing on the most impacted group of communities from either from COVID, from disasters, for any sort of shocks, and the way we see this anticipatory action have three major components. So this shock responsive social protection. So it's about focusing, ensuring that we have the least support required amounts of support for in terms of social protection. Early warning is important, but then again the question is, in this early warning, is this early warning for who, by who, or which technology are we using, and so on. And within this early warning, for example, this issue of risk communication, I think Yael mentioned about this feedback, and this is something that we have seen a lot when we focus too much on technology for early warning system. The end system, that is the people, it fails the system miserably. And for disaster risk reduction, it's about measure of people that can be safe. And say, for example, from 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, we have all the technology, but still we still fail people, because it's the people who matters towards the end of this whole system. And lastly, it's about this cash transfer mechanism is important. Sometimes having a social protection system available is important, but then if it doesn't reach the people who are in need, so the system of cash, having those transfer is important. So I mean, it's not a concluding statement, but I think this is a continuation, the way we see that now, of course, with all these, resources available, it goes back to those to not leaving anyone behind, and hence the social protection is utmost necessary now, than ensuring this systems that are shocks responsive, reaching the furthest end of the chain is, I think, something that we do now. Once we have this, then we may be able to recover slowly. Then we may go to then a different state that more a desirable state that we want. Yes, thank you, Julie.
Thank you. And Professor Rajan, have you got any comments that you'd like to make before we close down the conversation? Or have you already? Oh, sorry.
He's on mute, maybe.
Gone for that walk that he wanted to.
Oh, maybe he's out for a walk, yeah.
And anyone else then want to?
He's here, yeah.
I was just aware. No, I didn't have anything to add. I have already made it clear, and then I would like to send it to Riyanti for her comments, because it might not have made sense when I presented, but in written form, sometimes she might make sense, and then I think through conversation we will settle the issue there.
I have to say, your account of interdisciplinarity is the most crystal clear summation I've ever heard, and thank you for that. It was extremely illuminating for us.
Thank you.
And Yael, have you got things that you want to say as a final takeaway?
No, I think I spoke quite a bit. I think it was extremely interesting for me. And I think it's interesting to try to identify where different areas of system dynamics meet each other.
Absolutely, and where these various disciplines come together and perhaps to some extent overlap. So I'm going to hand over to Afira for just some final words, but thank you so much for your contributions, and thank you to those who came along to listen to these wise people.
Thank you.
Thank you
Afira.
very much. Thank you, Julie, for taking up the chairing, and thank you, the three of you that you came, and thank you who joined us, Sunha and Helen and Ailey and Ido and Harita. It's very nice to have a little bit of crowd. I don't know what happened to our colleagues, because last time we had a seminar, it was bigger. Maybe it was too frightening that we have a little bit of a different, not so much humanities-centered seminar. And thank you. It's always a pleasure to listen to the three of you, and I'm really happy to have managed to put you together in one space. I hope that we will be able to do that again sometime soon.
Yes, welcome.
Yeah, okay.
Bye.
I can stay around a little bit if anybody wants to continue chatting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Very much, Julie, Yael, the rest. Great to hear everyone.
Thank you, Riyanti, as usual. I'll just keep it on for some time. Okay.
I'm taking leave.
Yes.
Goodbye, Rajan.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Yeah. Okay. Good, Julie. Thank you very much for taking this up. And I'll stop recording now.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity. It was excellent. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Okay. That's good.
Good value.
I thought so.